Hi, Stephen.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. I have some folks in the waiting room, but I figured I would give a couple of minutes if you had anything you wanted to set up or anything like that first.
Go ahead and share my screen. How's the audio? Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. How's that look?
That looks great.
Excellent. Okay.
Perfect. And then I do have the Zoom recording right now. Is that okay with you if we record the session?
Absolutely.
Perfect. And then I was just thinking, I'll give a super quick introduction right away, and then I'll just pass it over to you. And that's all I've got.
Great.
Perfect. Okay, I'll go ahead and let some folks in here.
And how much time do we have today?
So we have total an hour. We have until 1. Hi, everyone. Thanks for hopping in. We're just going to give a few more minutes for people to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. And if people join us throughout the hour, we'll just have them join on in. But I'll start off with a quick introduction. My name is Alyssa Dalen. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a current student on campus and also the president of the new Interpersonal Violence Prevention and Awareness Student Organization. And so I'm really excited to be here and in collaboration with the CU Anschutz Phoenix Center and in acknowledgement of National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we're really thrilled to be joined by Stephen Hayden, the CEO and co-founder of Colorado-based nonprofit Envision U, which aims to close gaps in behavioral health outcomes for the LGBTQ+ population. And Stephen's going to share a presentation with us today that's focused on the experiences of interpersonal violence among the LGBTQ community. So Stephen, I'll just go ahead and let you take it from here and introduce yourself as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Alyssa. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today to talk about the impact and importance of IPV and domestic violence in the LGBTQ plus community. As mentioned, I'm Stephen Hayden. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the CEO of a Denver-based nonprofit called Envision U. Outside of my work at Envision U, I provide individual and group therapeutic services with a practice called Queer Asterisk. So, majority of the people that I serve are identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community. All right, so just a quick background about Envision You. We were founded in 2018, and our focus is working on improving the mental health and well-being of the LGBTQ community. We do that through a variety of ways. We work to raise public awareness around LGBTQ behavioral health concerns through a variety of statewide community-informed initiatives. Additionally, we promote policy and legislation that improves access to care and advances equity for those living with a mental health or substance use disorder. We're focused on encouraging recovery. We know that seeking behavioral health support is one of the most difficult and important steps a person with a mental health condition can take. And we work to empower individuals to find that courage to seek the support they need. As a person in recovery myself, I know that was one of the most difficult steps to make, is to actually ask for help and start my own recovery journey. We work to enhance resources with partners, including nonprofits, government agencies, and universities like the University of Colorado, and expand training. We recognize that admitting that a person needs help is one thing, but finding a welcoming and affirming provider to support a person's recovery is often most challenging. And that's something we hear throughout the research that we conduct, the difficulty of finding culturally responsive and affirming providers to deliver care to folks. So, domestic violence, which is also called intimate partner violence or interpersonal partner violence, as you all know, includes physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, as well as sexual coercion and stalking by a former intimate partner. An intimate partner is a person with whom an individual has or has had a personal or sexual relationship. Intimate partner violence affects millions of individuals in the US every year. So many people think of domestic violence as a heterosexual issue, but many in the LGBTQ plus community are victims and survivors. Domestic violence in the LGBTQ community is not only about abusive partners and relationships, but also about stigmas due to sexual orientation and gender identity. Sometimes facts about LGBTQ domestic violence are hidden behind myths and misconceptions, which are probably not surprising, but this belief that women or individuals that identify as women are violent, and men and people and individuals that identify as men aren't victims, that LGBTQ violence is reciprocal, and there are no significant differences between heterosexual and same gender domestic violence. Lesbian, gays, and bisexuals experience equally high or higher rates of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and stalking as heterosexuals. And we'll talk more about the trans and gender expansive community here in a bit. Although the research community has historically overlooked the ways in which LGBTQ communities experience domestic and sexual violence, recent literature is increasingly more inclusive and complete. As you'll see later, research shows that LGBTQ members fall victim to domestic violence at equal or higher rates compared to their heterosexual and cisgender counterparts. So examples of domestic and intimate partner violence. And again, some of the stuff I may be going over may be background and information that you're aware of, but I find it's also helpful to set a foundation for our conversation. So we know that conscious manipulation and control of one person by another through the use of threats, coercion, humiliation, and or force is one example. Isolation, abuser slowly severs all emotional ties except the one for them. Physical abuse, things that are obviously well known: hitting, punching, slapping, biting, restraining. Sexual abuse, forcing someone to have sex against their will. Psychological and emotional abuse, including manipulation. Isolation, as I mentioned, humiliation, lying, threats, threats to kill, threats to commit suicide, and verbal abuse, insults, name calling, financial abuse, creating debt, steals money, or uses money to control another person. And then, of course, stalking is something that is certainly common. So for transgender and gender expansive individuals, transgender individuals are more likely to experience threats or intimidation, harassment, and police violence within intimate partner violence. Specific violence that transgender and gender expansive people may face is partner using offensive or incorrect pronouns to refer to their identity, ridiculing the person's body and or appearance, and ridiculing the individual for their gender or sexual identity. So the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey found that respondents experienced some form of domestic violence, including acts involving coercive control and physical harm. So 54% of that community has experienced some form of domestic violence. Additionally, nearly half, about 47% of respondents were sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime, and 1 in 10 were sexually assaulted in the past year. I want to note that an updated transgender community survey was recently launched with results to be published in 2023. So if you have an interest in this or it's something that you would like to share with folks, I will put a link in the chat so folks can see. So this is the new U.S. transgender survey that I think came out about 2 weeks ago. And yeah, if it's okay, I can answer questions for folks at the end. Does that feel okay? And I'll monitor the chat and do that. Specifically for trans youth, this population experienced the highest levels of physical dating violence, including the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior System. It showed LGBTQ youth of color are at greater risk of physical and sexual dating violence when compared to non-LGBTQ white youth. So making that distinction not just with trans youth, but for trans youth of color, seeing even higher rates. And this is true, I think, throughout a lot of the data points that we see is the impact of these issues tend to be sadly more significant within certain subpopulations within the queer community. All right, so here's some additional statistics identifying the percentage of folks, individuals who've been impacted by IPV or domestic violence. For people who identify as male, majority of domestic violence or intimate partner violence is underreported. These statistics do not include transgender and gender diverse population, which we touched on the previous slide. I will note there, and that's something that you probably see in your work and the research that you do. The transgender and gender diverse population are often overlooked and not included in a lot of the research that happens around this community. And it's something that Envision U that we're actively engaged in, not only collecting the data through our own research that we do with a third party research organization, but in our public advocacy efforts, really pushing public policy and legislators to ensure that there's methods for data collection and funding to ensure that we have a full picture of the experiences of the entire queer community. Here's some information, some additional statistics around young people. Right, so the association between experiencing dating violence and attempting suicide in the past year among youth. So you can see about 45% of transgender folks had experienced some form of dating violence. Or cisgender was 31%. And again, this is among LGBTQ youth. Under 18, 49% had experienced some violence, and over 18, 27% experienced violence. So these numbers are staggering and incredibly troubling. All right, so on this slide, looking even more closely at the impact that this has on young people, 67% of LGBTQ youth disclose physical dating violence to at least one person. You see the statistics there looking at boys and men, looking at communities of color. But LGBTQ youth experience intimate partner violence will most likely tell a friend. So, thinking about what are those opportunities for disclosure and what ways are there to connect young people to care when they're experiencing uh, intimate partner violence or domestic violence. Significantly less report talking to a parent, and surprising to us in looking at this research, which is provided by the Trevor Project. Only 14% are comfortable sharing this experience with a therapist. So for anyone involved in providing direct care to young people, that's I think a statistics that is cause for concern for sure. And I think as professionals thinking about how do we overcome that significant reluctance among this population to talk about their experiences. All right, so reasons for underreporting. So othering the abused partner, this is seen particularly in relationships where the abuser self-identifies as heterosexual or cisgender, but the abused partner does not. Threats of outing somebody, which can have obviously profound consequences. Verbal abuse, attacking a person's identity. The abuser may invalidate a person's identity based on their past heterosexual relationship. Um, this can also include derogatory language, such as the refusal of using proper pronouns or chosen name to devalue the abused partner. Additionally, we see physical and sexual abuse as threats and then judgment around sexual activity. So some of the reasons for underreporting. All right, so what are some of the social barriers that exist? Although the response to LGBTQ victims of IPV and domestic violence is gradually improving, the LGBTQ plus community is often met with ineffective and victimizing legal responses. 45% of victims do not report the violence they experience to police because they believe they will not be helped by law enforcement. There are also still several barriers that exist to addressing LGBTQ intimate partner violence. Potential homophobia from staff or service providers, or from non-LGBTQ plus domestic violence victims that they may come into contact with. Additionally, lack of appropriate training around LGBTQ domestic violence for service providers. There remains a pretty significant gap there when we look at the training that's provided to professionals that work in this space. Most don't have access to training that's specific to this population. There's also a fear that airing their problems among the LGBTQ population will somehow take away from progress towards equality or fuel anti-LGBTQ bias. So it's really interesting to think that a person is experiencing extraordinary trauma, and one of the things they worry about is that by bringing this to the forefront, that somehow that is going to put at risk marriage equality or other uh, areas of progress for this community. That's a lot of pressure for a person to have in the midst of something incredibly traumatic. All right, so there are a number of barriers to receiving assistance. Research shows that LGBTQ people face these barriers to seeking help that are unique to their sexual orientation and gender identity. These include legal definitions of domestic violence that exclude same sex couples. So, in fact, that is the case in many places around the US. As indicated, and not surprising, dangers of outing oneself when seeking help and the risk of rejection and isolation from family, friends, and society. So, if you're not out and you're in a same sex relationship and you're experiencing domestic violence, by reporting those concerns, you will be essentially revealing information about who you're in a sexual or romantic relationship. The lack of or survivors not knowing about LGBTQ specific or LGBTQ friendly assistance resources for those who are doing this work, making sure that you have available those resources that can be supportive to this population. Certainly potential homophobia from staff of service providers or from non-LGBTQ survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence with whom they may interact. So a good example of this is, we hear from folks that go to shelters to seek protection, and the experience often with staff in those facilities is not affirming and supportive because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And it's made even more difficult by the other participants in the program who may express trans or homophobic comments and beliefs. The last thing I'll add here is just low levels of confidence in the sensitivity and effectiveness of enforcement officials in courts for the queer community. And so, if going in, you have all of these sort of larger macro societal concerns as it relates to your identity, and then very specifically, you have awareness that law enforcement in your community is not responsive to and supportive of the queer community, and that's obviously going to reduce significantly your willingness um, to pursue some sort of legal remedy. All right, so thinking about the myths that exist, and I realize in talking about these are in some ways relevant as well to folks that identify as cis and heterosexual, but there are some differences here. So, victims' appearance, what people typically think of when they hear victim of an intimate partner violence, right? There's this myth that a person is smaller in size, not able to fight, they're timid. Most people think of women or individuals that identify as women. The truth is, what an appearance of a victim looks like, of course, is anyone can be a victim to intimate partner violence, whether you're a man, woman, transgender, gender expansive, tall, short, muscular, non-muscular. Victims of abuse can sometimes not realize they're victims of intimate partner violence. Ben Benjarison is a great example of this. Ben talks in a TED talk he's done, could you be a victim of domestic violence? He describes himself as a big, tough police officer. He's 6'3", male, good education and good job. He never thought that he could be a victim of domestic violence until he went to a domestic violence website and completed a relationship checklist. In his talk, he revealed that he checked almost every box, and this is when he realized he had been a victim. So, just thinking about those myths and realities that exist. Self-defense, right? The myth is victims never defended themselves. The fact is, victims will use self-defense. It is not uncommon to hear victims using self-defense in an intimate partner violence relationship. I will note one of the things that I've seen in my work with incarcerated women in various state correctional systems around the U.S. is that Sadly, there is an overrepresentation of women and individuals that identify as women using self-defense and then actually being prosecuted for that. So there's definitely a concern there about how law enforcement responds to self-defense when looking at that experience for women versus men. So for domestic violence, myth and intimate partner violence is less severe in LGBTQ relationships. The fact is that abuse experienced by LGBTQ individuals can be equally or more damaging. Studies show that gay men and bisexual women are more likely to experience severe physical violence than their straight counterparts, including being beaten, burned, or tortured. Um, Abuser appearance. The myth here is that the more masculine, bigger, or stronger a partner is, that person is typically the abuser. The fact is, gender plays a significant role in perceiving and reporting instances of intimate partner violence. Many people gender the violence in LGBTQ relationships. So, for example, they may assume that the offender in a relationship is always the more masculine presenting partner. However, intimate partner violence does not discriminate. It can impact or be perpetuated by any person, regardless of their physical or personal attributes. All right, so as discussed, LGBTQ people already face increased risk of violence, including by an intimate partner, when compared to non-LGBTQ populations. This report shares the staggering rates of intimate partner violence for LGBTQ folks. So, we touched on some of these statistics, but again, just highlighting 44% of individuals that identify as lesbians and 61% of bisexual women experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to 35% of straight cisgender women. As noted earlier, 54% of transgender and gender expansive respondents experience intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. Among non-LGBTQ respondents to the most recent CDC survey, 77% reported experiencing physical dating violence, and 8% reported they experienced sexual dating violence. However, the Human Rights Campaign HRC's analysis of public data found that 18% of LGBTQ respondents reported experiencing physical dating violence, so it's more than twice, and then 16% reported experiencing dating violence, which is twice that of cisgender straight folks. So here, providing differing contexts of relationship violence and just thinking about um, dealing with stigma, HIV and AIDS, maybe there's a contextual factor here, use as a threat, believing no one else would want them since they are living with HIV or AIDS, no support available beside the abuser. 60% of HIV positive gay men in this study cited fear of becoming sick and dying as a major influence of their decision to remain within an abusive relationship. Effects of drugs and alcohol, a factor in creating a context here is in which violence is normalized or triggered within relationships. Thinking about members of the community who live in rural or small communities, right? There's increased isolation, lack of services and supports, and an increased presence of firearms. And we certainly know from the data that there's that correlation as well to higher rates of suicide attempts and suicide completions with the increased presence of firearms. And then experiencing dislocation as a recent immigrant is another factor as folks look at how to navigate um, domestic violence in their relationships and what resources are available. So recommendations and guidelines. So as noted, There is limited research in this field. Uh, that uses randomly selected representative samples. When that happens, the questions are often focused right on sexual identity and or gender identity, sexual orientation. But the fact is, we're just not collecting the data. In the absence of data, what we know from public health initiatives, both at sort of the nonprofit foundational level, but also with government. In the absence of data, it doesn't compel people to act in meaningful ways. And as a result, the money's not there either. So while overall research about the prevalence, effects, and other aspects of domestic violence among this community is lacking, there are a few studies that are devoted to this research. And certainly we continue to advocate and support expanded research in this area. Researchers who are doing this work should consider the prevalence, effects, risk factors, and help seeking related to domestic violence among this population, especially among transgender and gender diverse folks. Researchers should also consider studies that evaluate the effectiveness of programs devoted to reducing the prevalence of domestic violence among this community and programs to assist with survivors. So this is one area, excuse me real quick, there is a significant gap. So when you're thinking about prevention methods for this population, they're nearly non-existent. And I think for those of us who have done or are doing work in public health, there is this belief that there's this sort of one size fits all, works for everyone. And that, of course, is just not true. And it's particularly not true here. And so as we're thinking about interventions to address this, what are we doing to create programs that are specifically addressing prevention methods for this community and for those that are unfortunately impacted by these concerns? What are those support programs look like? How are we tailoring the content of those programs to speak directly to queer individuals who have been impacted by these issues? So some recommendations and guidelines, certainly offering a flexible range of programs, services, and community responses is necessary. Having available information on legal options, counseling, accommodation for programs for survivors, programs for folks who are the abusers, the perpetrators, and these acts, and outreach to the LGBTQ community as well, and to their families and friends. I'll admit that I'm an older gay man who's lived in multiple cities around the country, and rarely have I seen any messaging or efforts to engage the queer community on these topics. I think that's changed a little bit recently. I've seen some information at recent Pride events, but it's pretty limited. And so we have a lot of work to do to meet the community where they are, share information in places that people gather so that folks know there's help and hope available to them. All right, so as I sort of wrap up, I've got some resources here to take a look at. So these are some national programs that are available, and I can share with Alyssa the presentation so that you all can access these nationally. Here are some resources that are available. The last thing I'll say is, and it seems obvious, but based on the information I've shared, it's not in practice. Everyone deserves to live a life free of abuse, period. No matter your identity, your gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, immigrant status, these are all the concerns that thinking about how do we devise tailored approaches to various populations, including LGBTQ folks, to ensure that they can live a life free from abuse. So that's the formal presentation. I want to stop sharing and really just open it up for questions and discussion. I'm really interested in conversation, so it doesn't feel like I'm just talking to everyone. And I find it also to be much more interesting when I'm a participant in one of these lunch and learns. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Looks like we do have a couple of questions in the chat. If you want to, I can read them out, or if you want to just directly address those ones first.
Yeah, does emotional abuse have to be a conscious act by the perpetrator, or can it be unintentional but still emotionally abusive? So this comes from Benton. So thanks for the question. I mean, there's, I guess, two thoughts here. There's the legal definition of what constitutes domestic or intimate partner violence, and I can't speak to the specific statute here in Colorado and whether or not your question addresses that. But yeah, I think this idea of what's conscious and unconscious comes up. I also hear from folks that my partner was under the influence of a substance, and therefore maybe that mitigates their behavior. And in my position is that it absolutely does not. So, we are responsible for our actions, what we do and say, and legally, from that perspective, being under the influence is not a defense to committing a crime. It may be an underlying mitigator, but it's not a defense to. And I think similarly, my view, and again, I'm speaking from my um, perspective as somebody who's doing work in this space and as a mental health therapist, that uh, unintentional or unconscious abuse, nevertheless, a person should be held accountable for that. And I don't necessarily mean legally accountable, I just mean accountable for their actions. Are there restorative justice organizations that you know of in Denver? This is from Sammy. So I don't around this specific issue. Melissa, you may have some information there that could be helpful, but sadly, as it related to this specific issue, I don't. Melissa, are you familiar with any?
I don't know any specific restorative justice organizations around this space. I do know that there are some organizations specific to the queer community in the Denver, Colorado area. But I don't know of any of them that are doing work specifically with restorative justice.
Yeah, I know of some organizations that provide restorative justice services, but not specifically catered to the queer community or intimate partner violence. So I don't know if there's that exists in Denver.
Yeah, and I think, frankly, that's part of my concern with just how folks are seeking redress for their concerns is there just aren't those tailored programs, right? Where you can step in and know that you can be your authentic self and talk about your lived experience in a way where you're not going to be judged, harassed or discriminated against in some way. And so there's definitely an opportunity to do more here. And, your question is one that I'm going to share with our partners at Caring for Denver Foundation. So for those of you who live in the city and county of Denver, we have an initiative here that's funded in part by sales tax to support mental health initiatives. And so I'm going to reach out to them and just ask them if they are aware of any issues. Are they thinking about funding opportunities to create a queer specific restorative justice program? It's a really great point. Thanks, Sammy.
Awesome. Any other questions? You can feel free to just come off of mute and ask, or put them in the chat as well.
Yeah, and I would invite folks too, just to share your perspective or insight you have in the work you're doing as a professional, as a person, um, to the extent you're comfortable doing so. Um, One
Hey,
question I have, I'm sorry, go ahead.
oh, you're good. I was just going to say thank you so much for this presentation. I'm currently a student studying epidemiology, getting my MPH. And I was just curious, like, how can I best get involved in LGBTQ health, whether that's behavioral or another facet? Like, what are the things that I can do now to help out?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I appreciate that question for a number of reasons. As you know, as I indicated, so much of the history of public health has been focused on sort of this one size fits all. And we know that those solutions are often targeting white cis people of privilege, and that doesn't benefit the majority of folks in this country, except the dominant class. And so as I see MPH programs around the country starting to think more about intersectionality and targeted public health initiatives, I'm, excited that that is happening, not as quickly as I think probably most of us would like, but I'm glad to see those advances. Um, so, in your academic pursuits, I would say challenging your cohort, your peers, your professors on having these meaningful conversations about how are we as public health officials tailoring our efforts so that everyone benefits and often focusing on those priority populations. From my perspective, if LGBTQ folks, for example, use nicotine at higher rates than cis straight people, and yet when I talk to the Colorado Department of Public Health around their smoking cessation program, they have a sort of one campaign that's focused on everyone. And so my question and part of my advocacy is to say, well, wouldn't it make more sense to target the populations that are most impacted by nicotine in their life, and this idea of then them rising and then providing benefit to the community as a whole? And so thinking about population specific interventions, how does that benefit our community as a whole? How does it reduce expenses? Produce longer life and longevity, quality of life. I mean, I think there's just a lot of opportunity for us to think about what populations are most impacted by the issue, and then how do we devise tailored solutions to address those concerns.
And I also will say that this is a little bit of a plug, but also just related to your question, Benton. But the thought about how can we as students support interpersonal violence prevention and awareness in general, and also within the different intersectionalities, is something that we're kind of hoping to gather some thoughts and some activities around with the new interpersonal violence prevention and awareness student organization. So I'm just going to also add in to the chat a few links that I think I was going to share at the end anyway, but they fit right now. So a couple of links. There's a few more events that we're having this month, and then a couple in November as well, and then also just a form where we're getting students who might be interested in having these types of conversations, and we're hoping to just build some thoughts and activities on our campus around like centering interpersonal violence and all of the in all of the different populations that it impacts.
Yeah, Ben, was that helpful in providing a little bit more sort of context there? Do you have any additional thoughts on what would be beneficial to you as a student in thinking about your future career?
I think that was absolutely beneficial. I think that in my program, it is, I just started this semester, so it's still, new, just doing some core courses. But it seems like it's easier to bounce around topics than it is to bounce around target populations, if that makes sense. So like a lot of classes focus on like chronic disease or infectious disease or STIs, where I think there are many fewer courses offered that are specifically like equity related, or a specific course for LGBTQ focused health interventions. Um, so I guess I'm interested in trying to do that myself, even though those courses aren't necessarily offered. Um, so if there are opportunities to maybe do capstone or practicum work with LGBTQ focused organizations, I think that would be really helpful if those could be advertised on campus for the students that are interested in that. But yeah, I think the resources that Alyssa sent and the insight that you had, Stephen, was very helpful. So thank you for adding that.
So I was just going to add a quick question. Oh, sorry, Stephen, you can go ahead and say what you're going to say.
Oh, no, go ahead, Alyssa.
Okay, I was just going to ask a question about your experience, Stephen, with, we were talking about how, you know, the queer community has specific needs when it comes to some of the conversations around interpersonal violence, domestic violence. Do you have a perspective on whether it's more beneficial for there to be specific organizations addressing the queer community's needs, or whether it's more beneficial to work with existing organizations to build their awareness and capacity to work with specific populations like the queer community? So I wonder, from your experience working with different existing organizations or kind of forming your own goals, what that experience has been like.
Yeah, it's a great point and a good question. So, I'll just use myself an example. At Envision U, we have an extensive training program where we're training mental health professionals around the United States, with this idea of building those skills no matter where you're serving and who you're serving. No doubt the majority of people doing work in the public health space, mental health, medical, have clients, patients, people they serve who identify as queer. And so, yeah, definitely thinking about building up and supporting people who are delivering services. And when I was thinking about where I wanted to deliver clinical care as a therapist, I made a decision to go to work for a practice that all of our clinicians identify as queer. Majority of our clients identify as part of the community, and I just felt really committed to being in that safe space for myself as a professional, but also just really feeling confident that when a client comes into our community, that they're interacting with people that share their lived experience, and that all of our programs are tailored for queer folks. And so I think that's important as well. So I think, to the extent that we can work with existing structures, organizations, public health departments, et cetera, to improve the way they engage with this community, that's essential. And I think it's also vitally important that members of the community have places to go where they can get care and support from folks that truly understand their lived experience in a way that not all cis straight people are able to do.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Let me just add one more point that I think is really relevant here. I mean, not to be advocating particular political philosophies, but we have an election coming up in less than 2 weeks, right? And elections have profound consequences, as we've seen, certainly with the Supreme Court. But when we elect even state and local officials, right, these are people that control how money is spent. And when looking at creating new programs or expanding programs that exist, or What are the priorities, for example, at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment? I know I take all of that into consideration when I'm casting a vote in an election because I want the people who are in those elected positions as well as the people who are working in those policy departments to have the best interest of queer folks and other people with disadvantaged identities who are often just left out of the conversation. They're not part of research and programs are not tailored to their specific needs. So if there's one or two takeaways, hopefully some of the resources I've shared with you today are helpful and that we're all motivated to vote and engage in political advocacy as it does make a difference. Any other thoughts or questions? Happy to, I know we've got a few more minutes left, but certainly don't want to keep you all if you use a few minute break before your 1 o'clock. So I did put my email address in the chat. You're absolutely welcome to reach out. I'll send a list of my presentations so you have those resources available. I've also put the website to our organization in the chat, and please feel free to reach out anytime. Happy to engage with folks, think about resource sharing, and however I can be helpful.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us this hour, and also thanks, Stephen, for coming and sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Really appreciate being here today. And yeah, please feel free to reach out anytime.
Great. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you all so much. Have a good one.